Hi everyone, welcome to my channel. Today I want to talk about edges. To me, they are a crucial part of building my compositions and also such a powerful technique in watercolor painting in general. As I was editing the demonstration for this scene, I realized it's a great example of how I use edges, both soft and hard. So I thought I would take a moment to walk you through my approach in a bit more detail along with this painting demonstration. I'm wetting the sky with a large brush, which is not very clean, which is not ideal, but it actually works here because you can see where I apply the water to. And then I'm preserving the white of the paper, so I'm keeping the paper dry where I want my big fluffy cloud to be. And as I apply the paints to the paper, I'm not touching the edge where the wet and the dry paper meet because I want the paint to slowly travel into that area. This will help me create a more interesting and soft edge. This is in the top right corner. The top left corner is a bit different, which is how I want it to be, because in every element of my landscape I actually want to have both soft and hard edges, because I believe that this creates a lot of expression and interest, and it makes every element of the scene more exciting to look at. Imagine if all of the edges in the composition were either soft or hard. This would result in a very flat and uninteresting image, and that's the reason why I always try to have both soft and hard edges in every part of my scene. Painting wet on wet creates softer edges, and painting wet on dry creates harder edges. And when I paint my backgrounds, I want them to stay in the back of the scene. I do not want them to pop. And that's the reason I prefer painting my backgrounds, like the sky here, wet on wet. And even if I'm adding this shadow, I'm also adding it into the wet area of the paper, and then I'm also softening the edges with a clean wet brush, so that part of the composition doesn't attract too much attention to itself and it stays in the background. I always paint at a slight angle, so the top part of my paper block is placed on a support, so it's raised slightly, and as I paint, the colors continue to travel downwards very slowly, so I always keep an eye on the edges, because you can see now in the top right we have a hard edge developing, and I'm not a very big fan of it because I do not want the edges to be very hard in that area, otherwise the cloud will lose its fluffiness. So I will adjust the edges with a point of a thin brush, and I would like this edge to be a bit more interesting to look at, not as harsh, not as sharp looking. It's very easily fixed when the edges are wet. Once they're dry, it's not really that easy to deal with that, so I always try to do it before the paint dries. I am quite happy with the way the sky looks with the cloud and the softness of it and the interesting edge along the edge of the cloud, the top edge of the cloud. So I have dried it and I'm moving on to painting the next element of my composition, and it's going to be the distant hills. So I'm also painting them wet into wet. I am applying the paint and then I'm softening the edges with the wet brush to give the hills a much softer look. And this helps with, again, pushing the hills into the background. And as I'm adjusting the bottom part of this edge here, you can see that I left a few gaps of dry paper when I allowed some of the paint to travel downwards and some of the paint to stay at the edge of that thin dry area of the paper. This is another way to create an interesting looking edge. And as I'm painting the other side of the hills, you can see that I used a dry brushing technique to create an exciting looking edge in the bottom left area. And it is a much easier effect to create on cold press or rough paper. And I think it's one of the most exciting ways to play with edges in watercolor. And if we look at this composition, it is going to be quite a simple one, but these edges, these exciting looking edges, they actually help make the whole composition much more interesting, much more engaging for the viewer, and the edges help the viewer's eye to travel through the scene, and we want to guide the viewer through the scene by making them stop and admire some of the areas or continue their journey onto the focal point. And these little areas of interesting edges, different looking edges as well, like the dry brushing and the small gaps of white paper on the right, they create a much more engaging viewing experience. Note that I created a lot of softness and lightness right in the center of the composition. So the area is looking quite hazy, quite atmospheric, and this will first of all allow me to place my tree there later, so it will not compete with the darker hills in the back. It will stand out against the background, and also this softness in the center creates that atmospheric look. And I actually really like making my backgrounds very soft and my focal points quite hard, lots of hard edges there, in order to create that play and that contrast between the foreground, the background, and the focal point. So I'm now moving on to the foreground, and I'm going to start adding the warm yellow into the wet area of the paper here, and this will create a connection between the background and the foreground. And I did create some dry brushing at the bottom edge of the foreground, but then I didn't really like it because I thought it was competing with the dry brushing area in the hills in the background, and I softened it. Again, it was very easy to do because the paper is still very wet, and as I'm loading more and more paint into that wet wash, I further soften the colors and the edges. So having this softness allows us to connect different elements of the composition, again creating that cohesive look. So I'm quite happy with the way the background and the foreground look now. They look very connected, so I'm going to dry this wash and move on to creating my focal point. So the wash is now dry, and I'm going to add the tree. I'm going to add it wet on wet, but I added just a little bit of water onto the paper first because I do not actually want the tree very soft, because harder edges create more contrast, and we need more contrast within the focal point, so it attracts a lot of attention and it holds the viewer's eye. So that was the reason I only added just a touch of water to the paper, just to allow the paint to start flowing gently. And I'm also using a much smaller brush that allows me to add smaller details with lots and lots of hard edges within this foliage, lots of gaps of this dry paper that will describe the tree crown in quite a bit of detail, and again also create these hard edges that will keep the attention of the viewer on the focal point. And now that the tree has been placed into the composition, we can see that the dry brushing effect at the bottom of the hills on the left actually becomes part of the focal point. It is quite close to that main area of interest, so the strong contrast is very welcome there. So the viewer's eye, as it travels from left to right along that edge of the dry brushing, it goes towards the main area of interest, the anchor of my composition, which is the tree. So in my landscapes, in my paintings, I want to create a variety of edges, both soft and hard, and interesting looking edges too, within every single element of the composition, like the clouds here, the hills, the foreground, and the tree. But I do not want those soft and hard edges to compete with each other. So I make sure that, say, the clouds have mostly soft edges with a little bit of hardness here and there. And I want my borders to be mostly soft, and I want the focal point to be mostly hard, to have mostly hard edges, because again, harder edges, they attract more attention, and it is actually a very fun way to guide the viewer through the composition. So let's have a closer look at the different elements of the scene here. So if you look at the clouds, we have mostly soft edges with some hard edges here and there. If we look at the hills, it's the same. We have mostly soft edges, and then on the left we have harder edges that point towards the tree, and they become more of a leading line that takes us towards the main area of interest. And also along the borders of the composition we have softness, and in the center of the composition within the tree we have a lot of hard edges, and that again is the way to make sure the eye travels towards the focal point and stays on the focal point. But that journey is quite interesting because the viewer's eye can stop here and there and admire the dry brushing technique and admire the interesting looking edges at the top of the cloud, and also the softness in the background adds to the overall atmospheric feeling in this scene. And we have mostly soft edges here, so the overall feeling of the scene is quite atmospheric, quite hazy, quite lovely. The dark lines of the tree trunk and the branches, they are also quite hard. They are hard edges, so they do add to that strong contrast in the focal point. And as I am approaching the final stages of creating this landscape, I am assessing what else it needs. So here I decided that the cloud didn't have enough weight, the shadows were not strong enough, so I adjusted them slightly. And notice how I also kept some of the areas hard and some of the areas soft. Another thing I haven't mentioned yet is that you can use soft and hard edges to describe the shape of an object within the composition better. For example, here when I was painting the tree, I added the shadows and the highlights. So I used a darker, cooler green for the shadows and some warm yellow for the highlights. I added them wet on wet. So I dropped them into the wash when the tree was still wet. That allowed me to create a more rounded look in the tree. But say if I wanted to paint a house or a box and I wanted the edges to be very well defined, then I would add the shadows and the highlights wet on dry to create those really sharp, strong lines. But here for the tree, for the rounded shape of the tree, adding the highlights and the shadows creates softer edges and allows to give this a really lush look to the tree crown. So when we try to create atmospheric perspective in our landscapes in watercolor, we need to make sure that we have harder edges in the foreground and softer edges in the background. Because in real life, if you look towards the horizon, you will often see haze, or an object that is far away from us will look more hazy, softer. That's because the light has to travel through all those air particles. And those air particles obviously soften the vision of that object in the distance. So to pull the foreground closer to us here, I'm adding lots and lots of small grassy patches here, because all those small brush marks that I'm creating here, they are technically just small hard edges, lots and lots of small hard edges. And that helps us to bring the foreground closer to us and to push the background further into the distance. Another easy way to help create more hard edges in the foreground, to help bring it forward, is to add, say, a pile of rocks with lots of sharp lines, sharp defined edges. So that adds a lot of contrast and helps with creating atmospheric perspective in your work. So here I am continuing to add those grasses, those grassy patches. I actually quite enjoy this process. It does take a while to add those small details, but I find this quite meditative. It's a very relaxing way to add more complexity, and I think it always makes the foreground much richer. And another way to add hard edges is to create lots of small splatters, because again, splatters are just tiny little areas with well-defined edges. And if you have been watching my channel for a while, you know that it's one of my most favorite techniques to use in adding complexity to my landscapes. And same with adding the birds, because they are pretty much just a bunch of tiny little hard edges, and I always place them close to the focal point so they add that definition to the main area of interest. So this scene is now almost complete, and I am very happy with the way it looks, because we have a nice combination of soft and hard edges here. They're all very interesting. I use a few different techniques here, like painting wet on wet or dry brushing to create those interesting edges. This landscape is simple, but it's exciting to look at. It is atmospheric. The eye travels around it quite well, in my opinion. So this is a very nice demonstration of the power of using soft and hard edges in your work. So I hope you have found this helpful. If you have any questions, as always, ask me in the comments. Thank you for watching and happy painting!